So just really making the point that New Zealand is home to a large number of companion animals, and for the most part, whether they're dogs or whether they're cats, they're considered to be members of the family. And interestingly, there are more cats than dogs in New Zealand that are kept as household pets. But in both cases, they are members of the family. And there are other species. There are 3% of New Zealand households that have rabbits as household pets, and 50% of these are considered to be members of the family. And the other species that people get a lot of pleasure out of owning are horses, and 2% of New Zealand households share the home with at least one horse. And these are the horses that are used for pleasure riding, for hacking, for trekking. So, animals in New Zealand, there's a lot of them, but they're there because they're considered to be members of the family, and they give pleasure to their owners. And where people haven't been able to have a companion animal in their home, at least half of those would say that they would like to have an animal, and that they have a barrier to being able to own an animal due to their lifestyle not being compatible, but also perhaps because they just can't have an animal because they're living in rented accommodation. So, having a companion animal is important, even if you haven't got one, to many people. So I guess without really having to emphasize the point too much, people like their companion animals. They want to have them. They consider them to be members of the family. And so the quality of their life matters to their guardians. And of course, the quality of the animal's life will matter to the animal. So I don't think we need to make the case for why quality of life actually matters. There's a whole range of research that looks into quality of life and particularly into the benefits of having a pet from a child's point of view, also for health reasons, for older people and so on. So there's real benefits to having companion animals in one's life. And these pictures here, I just thought you'd like to have a look at them. This is me in the top picture with my godmother's cat, Henry. And this is my son when he was very little with a family dog. I'm not sure the dog looked particularly keen on being cuddled. But the important thing here is that these are animals that are very memorable to us. And so, we have this really close relationship with our animals. But not only is animal welfare important to guardians, it's not just important to the animals, but it's also important to New Zealand. And I mentioned that at the beginning of the conference. The important thing here is that animal welfare matters, but it's also recognised that it's often a compromise between the animal's needs and the human's needs and desires. And it's the society that we live in that determines what compromises to animal welfare are acceptable or necessary or considered to be reasonable. And the thing I want to point out here is that society's views about what is acceptable can change. And that change happens because of pressure from the public. That might have been driven through research. It might be because just there's an ethical view on something that is now considered to be unacceptable. And there are many, many examples of how we've changed our views as more information has come to light. So when we're looking at changing things for animals, shifting the baseline of what we might consider to be normal and acceptable now, we recognise that there are a number of different examples of this, one being tail docking in New Zealand, which took a long time to be banned. Lots of very strong points of view about it, not least from the dog, I'm sure. But, we did shift that baseline. It is no longer acceptable to take the tail off a dog for cosmetic reasons. And the same goes for some of the challenges that the horse performance sports face in different parts of the world, where some of the training methods have been questioned, some of the equipment is questioned. And for many of those horse people, they would have thought that as being quite normal and acceptable. But of course, they're now having to view it through a different lens because media, the public, are looking at these things quite differently. And if we want to have a social license to operate, particularly around things like using animals for performance, we have to be able to answer the questions that are being asked in relation to the animal's quality of life. And at the moment, as Minister O'Connor mentioned, there is this whole question of cats and their place in New Zealand society. And, we're seeing increasingly that cats are being registered, they're being microchipped, and there's in some cases a requirement for this to be done to ensure that cats are able to be identified as domestic owned and pet cats. Anyway, so we want to shift this baseline to a good life for animals. So that means that we need to have good evidence of what a good life is, and we need to be able to convince people who are not yet convinced that that's an important thing for our society to accept and to drive towards. So the problem is that when we start to shift things a little bit, we need to bring people along with us. And that sometimes, and this is the horse example I've just given you here, sometimes that does require complete change in attitudes and beliefs. And this can be challenging for some people. People who are quite content with how they are very resistant to change. And making a commitment to a new way of doing things does take a fair bit of convincing. And sometimes that has to be that has to come through legislation. But the key thing when we are going to talk about improving, advancing animal welfare is that we need to recognise that we have to understand human behaviour. We need to understand why humans do the things they do, what will drive them to change, what will motivate them. And if we don't know about those things, it's very difficult for us to change the world for animals. So, and this is the sort of things that Companion Animals New Zealand has explored previously at a conference in 2018, which was all about human behaviour change for animals, where we workshopped a whole range of different things in order to look at what would be the best human behaviour change methods that would meet New Zealand's needs for changing attitudes, beliefs and behaviours when it came to animal welfare. And I just thought this might be interesting to remind those who were at the conference that at that conference, when we asked participants before they came to the conference what they thought the main themes for, the main issues were for animals in New Zealand, irresponsible companion animal ownership was identified as the top most significant animal welfare theme. But when we went through the conference, having given a whole range of different talks, some different types of evidence, what was interesting was that participants that were then surveyed after the conference had changed their point of view. They still thought irresponsible companion animal ownership was important, but not as important as they had thought previously. And I guess this is a kind of demonstration of how human behaviour change initiatives occur. You give people good information, particularly people who want to learn and want to hear about it, and they can use that to form opinions that might actually change their thinking a little bit. So apart from the human behaviour change element, what are the other big game changers for advancing animal quality of life? And this is really what we're going to talk about throughout this conference. But I think Minister O'Connor mentioned this as very important in terms of that game changing. And that was the appreciation that animals are sentient, that they're capable of feeling, but not just feeling anything. They're capable of feeling both negative and positive emotions. And quality of life isn't just about the physical health of the animal or its behavioural health or the behavioural opportunities it has, but also its mental health, so the emotional sort of state that the animal is in. And those emotional states, whether they're positive or negative, are what actually drives that animal's behaviour and its behavioural response to all of the things that it might meet within its life. And it's important that we try to explore what this is. So trying to get access to that secret mental life of our animals is the challenge for a lot of our researchers right now. Really exciting challenge, but it is a challenge. But the important thing from the good life perspective is that it's generally accepted that animals that are experiencing positive emotions, ones that we would call pleasure or happiness, are in a positive emotional state, that their needs are likely to be being met, and their welfare is therefore good. Their quality of life is therefore good. So we need to understand a lot more about what a good life looks like. What are good or positive emotions in animals? Quality of life is important to humans. And there's a lot of studies about this, lots of surveys that take place throughout the year. This is one. I think Finland is the Finnish people are the top ones at the moment. But the ones at the moment that are in a dreadful state are Afghanistan. But you can see New Zealand and Australia and the UK. Generally, we're happy people. And when we start to explore what happiness is in humans, it's defined as a state of well-being, with people experiencing positive or pleasant emotions. And there are lots of different views that have come out about what makes people happy, pleasurable activities, life having a purpose, and so on. And these sorts of pieces of research are important for us to be able to understand, what kind of lives we want to live, how we live our best life. And there are these happiness research institutes, and apparently Danish people are very, very happy people. And there's explorations about why that would be the case. The methodology that's used in humans to look at quality of life involves self-report, surveys, and observations. Now, here comes the challenge for us. Animals, of course, can't tell us how they feel. And that's an important thing. I mean, there might be some people who believe that they can speak and that they can tell us how they feel, but generally they don't tell us how they feel in the way that a human will through self-report, but they can show us how they feel. And this is the kind of route that scientists have gone down in order to explore animal sentience, animal feelings. So the question really is, for us, is to agree whether or not animals, non-human animals, will experience positive affective states or emotions that humans would call pleasure and happiness. And, this is a really important piece of work, and it's being written about increasingly now, is what is animal happiness? How do we know? And how do we make sure that we give an animal a happy experience in life? So quality of life, if we think about what a good quality of life would be, it would be when an animal has what it needs and wants, and when it can avoid the things that it doesn't want. And then we can be sure that there's a better chance of it being in this positive mental state, positive affective state. What we do have to recognize is that when we see the world through their eyes, we have to know that we don't know much about what's going on inside them. So the first two, the internal environment, and of course the animal's previous experience, are what shapes how that animal will respond to the external environment or the external factors that it's having to deal with. So its internal emotional state is going to be the thing that is really important in terms of how it copes with all of the different challenges that it's faced with, whether it's living as a companion animal, going to shows as a horse, or even going on a truck as an animal that's going for export. And we try and measure these responses of the animals through various objective measures that have been developed throughout the last few years by animal welfare scientists, and they involve physiological and behavioural and cognitive measures. But generally speaking, we're better at measuring indicators of negative emotional responses like stress or fear or pain, and also emotional states in the moment. So what's going on right now, rather than necessarily how that's shaping the animal's life. But the animal-based measures that we do have, they're really exciting measures because they do allow us to explore the world through the animal's eyes. And this is just a hen that has been trained to push a panel or to push a button a number of times in order to get to a particular resource, whether that's food or whether that's another hen or more space. But using this approach, scientists have got a little bit further in understanding the world from the animal's point of view. We also have got other ways, objective measures, that allow us to look at how important the human is in the relationship or in the interaction. And we now feel very strongly that positive human-animal interactions and relationships can elicit positive emotions in those animals. And animals will often seek and enjoy interacting with humans. So where you're seeing more of this happening within an environment, you can be sure that the animal is likely to be in a more positive state. Now, here's some exciting research that looks at more specific positive behaviours. It was shown that rats will tickle each other when they're playing, and they emit high-frequency squeaky or clicks you can hear that demonstrate that they giggle. This is called giggling. But it's also something that the rat will solicit from a familiar human, and again will show this giggling behaviour when it's tickled and stroked by the human. So, I mean, I think you could say that if this is happening, then the animal is likely to be experiencing something positive. Play is also a good indicator of positive affective state. So I would say that if we're looking at these piglets, most people would say that their behavioural expression is one of happiness or joy. And, and so play is quite useful. If you see animals playing, then generally all of their welfare needs are likely to be being met. And they're now able to use energy to do something that is enjoyable to them. And there are other sorts of behavioural expression, and all of these behavioural expressions have been considered to be a very useful tool called qualitative behavioural assessment that allow you to trust your eyes. They map very well onto objective measures when scientists such as Francois Wemmelsfeld and others have looked at this more closely. And there are new areas for research. There are pain faces, for example, that have been looked at in a very objective manner. But there's also now work looking at happy faces, looking at positive emotions in other species. So there's lots of different ways that we're trying to measure animal quality of life and get sort of closer to the animal's emotional state. But I just wanted to talk just briefly about this. This looks complicated, but basically this is a model put together by Mike Mendel, and what it's looking at is how we can map animals' mood state and arousal state onto the Y and X axes that you've got here. And so the animals that you can see on this side of the quadrant 1 and 2, these are animals that you can see are in an excited or happy or relaxed and calm state, whereas the animals that are over on the left-hand side are more likely to be animals that are in a negative emotional state, fearful or anxious, sad or depressed. This is Tatiana, my dog, and you can see Tati's at the beach on the right-hand side. Tati is cuddled up with her cat down at the bottom in a relaxed and calm state. Tati had first sort of been put in the kennel with her friend, not a happy situation, quite stressed, suffering a little bit from separation problems. And this one down here, Tati's very rarely unhappy. But in this situation here, Tati is it's her first kind of being away from her siblings, and she was pretty low and not really very interactive. So, you can see how we could start to objectively measure things for animals and start mapping them here to be able to look overall at what their emotional state is. And just, to take this further, some very clever scientists have looked at things like cognitive bias. This might come up as part of the papers today. But this is really looking at the mood state of an animal based on its previous experience in life. And animals that are in a pessimistic state are generally animals that have had not a particularly great experience throughout their lives. And when they're in that mood state, you can test for it, because they'll generally be animals that will not really feel that anything good is going to happen in their world. And here's a training test that has looked at whether or not these animals are in a pessimistic or optimistic state. So they're trained, the bucket on the left has food, the bucket on the right has no food. You can see here, plus and minus. And when those animals are then confused, if you like, by having a bucket put in the middle after they've been trained that food's normally on the left, the animals that are more pessimistic, they've perhaps experienced bad things in life, generally will be the ones that are slower to approach the bucket. They don't think there's probably likely to be food. They don't know what's going on. They don't want to make a decision. And you can see the bar chart at the bottom here. This is blue is pet dogs. The red are the shelter dogs. That if you look at the trials 1, 2, and 3, the shelter dogs increasingly are much slower to make a choice when they're asked to make an ambiguous, make a choice using an ambiguous cue. So these are clever tests now that are looking much more deeply into the mood state of the animal. So if we're going to move animals towards a good life, we need to start to understand much more about what these positive emotions look like, how we can measure them, how we can assess them. We need to reduce the negative emotions and we need to increase those positive ones. And we need to move from a life worth living to an animals enjoying a good life. And that's really what this whole conference is about. I'm looking forward to the talks that will follow me. It's about really looking at animals being able to feel well, being able to live well, and being able to function well. And actually, isn't that what humans also want? They want to be happy, they want to be in good health, and mostly they want to be prosperous or at least able to live well. So when it comes to looking at animals, it doesn't matter that they're somewhat different to us. It doesn't matter whether we talk about affective states or emotions. The reality is, as this Ingrid Newkirk said, when it comes to feelings, a rat is a pig is a dog is a boy. We're all we're all animals. We're all have the same central nervous system and the ability to feel. We're all sentient. But sparing animals from negative experience does not ensure good welfare, because providing these positive experiences is also necessary. So I'd say the absence of signs of positive affect or emotional state might well be a symptom of emotional discomfort or a negative welfare state. So it's important that we understand these and we use them to be able to provide animals with a good life, because a good life for animals means that we've also got improved outcomes for people. So thank you all very, very much indeed.